Hello everyone, my name is Gary O'Mealy, and in this video we are going to discuss what does a human need in order to stay alive. So the first thing I want you to do, and you may need to pause the video for a minute, is I want you to make a list of all the things that you think a single person, a single human person needs in order to stay alive. So while you're doing that, I want you to make sure you're thinking about how those things relate to physiological function, even if we are at the very beginning of a physiology course. So be thinking of what does your body actually need in order to stay alive. So if we tackle the obvious needs, your list may not be very long, and that's okay. So a good list would probably include very general things like food, the oxygen in the air, water that we drink, and then of course shelter. Now, if we relate this to human physiology, the human body, just like the body of any other organism, requires certain environmental conditions that are favorable for being alive and having a healthy existence. So with that in mind, all of the requirements for life that we've listed out should in some way satisfy molecular and cellular criteria for all the different various chemical reactions that are happening inside our cells at any given time, or other physiological processes that in some way contribute to the homeostasis that we talked about before. Now, the list we put together is a very general one, a very vague one, so let's get into a little bit more detail with them. For starters, the word food is very vague, so we can actually split food up into three different categories. First, we can have oxidizable substrates, or what your book calls energy-yielding molecules. And then you also have vitamins and minerals, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Oxygen and water are fairly self-explanatory, but we will talk about specifically why we need them. And then shelter is a little bit vague, but you probably understand that shelter keeps us safe from extreme temperature and extreme pressure. So we'll talk all about these in this video. If we start with oxidizable substrates, these are what you would call your food molecules. These are used by cells in your body to make energy that your body needs in order to get things done. The energy in these food molecules is tied up in chemical bonds, and future videos will detail how your body's cells and how all of your metabolic reactions actually function to extract this energy out of these food molecules into a usable form. These high-energy oxidizable substrates include carbohydrates, lipids, and to a lesser extent proteins. So these are the food molecules that we get from the food that we eat, and our body uses them for energy. Cellular respiration is a very important cellular process that most cells in the body go through. This is a multi-step process that our cells use to extract the energy out of these food molecules via a chemical process called oxidation. And then once the energy is extracted, that energy is stored in a very important molecule called adenosine triphosphate, which you can see an illustration of over on the right side. So ATP is extremely important, and we will talk more about the importance of ATP in the future, but for now you can think of ATP as being the cell's energy currency. So macromolecules like these carbohydrates, proteins, and lipids that our cells use for energy are broken down by the digestive system into smaller components that can be absorbed through the intestinal lining into the bloodstream and then delivered to cells in the body by the circulating bloodstream. So different substrates will provide varying amounts of energy. For example, lipids provide more energy on a per molecule basis than carbohydrates do, but cells in the body tend to have preferences. The brain, for example, prefers glucose. The heart, for example, prefers lipids. So there's a little bit of nuance there in terms of which cells in the body prefer which type of substrate. But for the most part, most cells in the body can use glucose. Now, before we get into any further on that, we'll talk about the other kind of very related necessary requirement for human function, and that is oxygen. The respiratory system will function to capture the air that is all around us that is very rich in oxygen from our surroundings, and we capture that air in our lungs. The oxygen that's in the air will move from the inside of the lungs into the bloodstream, so those oxygen molecules will cross the very thin membranes of our lungs to get into the bloodstream, and then this oxygen is carried through the blood and delivered to cells in the body that are actively performing cellular respiration. So that's kind of the theme here. For a cell to perform cellular respiration, you have to have both the food molecule, the oxidizable substrate, and you have to have oxygen too. So that's why we're talking about these two things together. So once these things are actually absorbed into the bloodstream, either through the digestive system or the respiratory system, so simple substrates like glucose, that's a very simple carbohydrate molecule, those will circulate throughout the body. And then similarly, oxygen that gets carried through the blood by a type of protein called hemoglobin, which you find in your body's red blood cells or erythrocytes. Remember, glucose and oxygen here are both very important to cellular respiration. We circulate them throughout the body in the bloodstream, and then when the bloodstream carries these molecules by a cell that is performing cellular respiration, these molecules need to be delivered. So like I said, both of these molecules are necessary components for cellular respiration. And even though cellular respiration is a multi-step process, it is sometimes simplified like this. Glucose plus oxygen, which again are both necessary for cellular respiration, and after cellular respiration is over, we will be left over with carbon dioxide, water as our byproducts, and then any energy that we extract out, which will then be packaged into ATP. So like I said, both the substrate and the oxygen, which are circulating throughout the bloodstream, they need to diffuse from the bloodstream into the interstitial fluid and then into the intracellular fluid of the respiring cell. So we can see them move from the bloodstream into the cytoplasm of this cell that is going to undergo cellular respiration for us. And then after cellular respiration is over, both the glucose and the oxygen are consumed, and the cell uses that energy that gets extracted out of the glucose or some other molecule to produce that high energy ATP molecule that we were harping on as being so important earlier. And then also, we'll talk about this in the future, the carbon dioxide that gets produced as a byproduct leaves the cell, gets carried through the bloodstream so that we can expel that excess carbon dioxide from the body using the respiratory system. Now, this is all very important, both food and oxygen together, because both are necessary for the most efficient ATP production our cells can provide. Now, usually having enough food is not really an issue unless you are starving to death, but there are conditions in which cells may not get enough oxygen. And if cells start to run out of oxygen, their ATP production is going to greatly suffer. Your cells will actually make almost 20 times more ATP with oxygen than they will without. So this is especially important because there are certain organs and tissues in the body that cannot tolerate not producing a ton of ATP. Good examples of these are the brain and the heart. They both require a very high volume of ATP production because they are performing very high intensity, very high importance physiological activities. So if these tissues, if these organs start to run out of oxygen, they will not be able to produce very much ATP. And that is going to be nothing short of catastrophic for the body. This is how you get heart attacks and strokes. They are the result of the brain in the case of stroke and the heart in the case of heart attacks not getting enough oxygen and failing to produce enough ATP to meet their energy demands. Okay, if we move on to vitamins and minerals, which are also things that we get from the food that we eat, these are not specifically energy-rich substrates that we were talking about before, but these are still very important things that are necessary for those same chemical reactions that we were talking about before. So minerals are going to be things like sodium and potassium and calcium and chloride, minerals that are going to be dissolved in our bodily fluids and are going to be important for a variety of things, including the function of the nervous system and things like that. And then heavy metal ions like iron and magnesium and copper and manganese and things like that, those are what we call cofactors. They actually interact with your body's enzymes and aid in their catalytic activity. But we'll have more to say about that in a future video specifically on enzymes. And then vitamins like riboflavin, ascorbic acid, biotin, the list goes on and on. These are nutrients that we get from the diet. We don't use them for energy either. We don't get energy out of the minerals either. But these are what we call coenzymes. Just like the cofactors do, they interact with the body's enzymes and aid in their function, just in a slightly different way. Now, if you want a good real-world example of a vitamin and its necessity, let's talk about vitamin C, which is sometimes called ascorbic acid. So, vitamin C is a necessary coenzyme for two enzymes called lysyl hydroxylase and prolyl hydroxylase. Those two enzymes are involved in synthesizing collagen, which is a very, very, very important protein that is a very important structural component of your body and your skin. Without proper vitamin C intake, those enzymes are not going to be able to function properly. So those chemical reactions that assemble these collagen fibers and keep our skin looking nice and healthy, those reactions will not occur, and this leads to a very uncommon disease these days called scurvy. Scurvy was, however, very common way back in the early days of exploration, the 1300s, 1400s, and 1500s, before we knew about the necessity of vitamin C. Sailors would all get on a ship and sail across the ocean for months at a time, and all they would bring to eat for themselves is salt-cured meat. They would not bring citrus fruits to make sure that they get their vitamin C. That's just a case of not knowing any better, but we know better nowadays. Water, I'm not going to spend too much time harping on, not only because it's a little bit self-evident, but because we're going to have videos focusing specifically on water in the future. But water really is the most important nutrient that we're going to obtain on a daily basis. Number one, it is the medium in which our body's metabolic reactions occur, and it also sets the concentration of all those solutes that we talked about before: sodium, potassium, glucose, calcium, magnesium, and things like that. And then additionally, water is also a very critical component of our body's temperature regulation system. We've talked about that before with both sweating and shivering. So finally, we're going to move on to the shelter component of what we need in order to survive. One reason that you need shelter is in order to live in a comfortable temperature range. So the way we're going to understand this is with respect to those chemical reactions that are happening inside the cells of our body that we talked about before. So it turns out that these metabolic reactions are very, very, very sensitive to changes in temperature, meaning that these reactions will only really occur very efficiently if the temperature is at a very specific point. So this underlies the importance of your body maintaining temperature homeostasis. We've obviously talked about sweating and shivering and how those are, to a certain extent, very effective at maintaining a normal range of temperature in the body, but they only really work if the temperature outside, the external temperature, falls within a very normal or very narrow range. So sweating and shivering aren't really going to get you anywhere if you are in the inside of a volcano or in the inside of an iceberg. You still need to be living and existing within a fairly comfortable temperature range. So if we think about this in terms of the body's metabolic reactions, you can actually see a graph here showing how well or how poorly these chemical reactions are performing as a function of the body's core temperature. Our body's set point temperature is 37 degrees Celsius, so you can see that is the point in which these chemical reactions will be occurring most efficiently. If the temperature is too low, you can see these chemical reactions slow down quite a lot. So that's an argument in favor of making sure that the body temperature does not get too low, because then those chemical reactions will slow down a lot and our body will not be able to make ATP very well. On the flip side, if the body temperature gets way too high, these reactions are also going to slow down a lot. So you don't want the body temperature to be too low, and you don't want it to be too high. This is the argument in favor of why the body needs to maintain a core body temperature as close to 37 degrees as we possibly can get it. And then finally, if we discuss a narrow pressure range, this one may be a little less self-evident because you've more than likely never found yourself in a situation in which the atmospheric pressure was uncomfortable for you. But atmospheric pressure will change as a function of either altitude above sea level or depth below sea level. As the altitude increases, the pressure goes down, and as your depth below sea level increases, the pressure goes up. So what this is going to do is really limit the places on Earth in which we can comfortably live. Now, to get a couple of definitions out of the way, pressure is just the amount of force applied per unit area. And since we're talking about atmospheric pressure, the pressure we experience is really just the pressure of the gases in the atmosphere like nitrogen and oxygen pushing down on our bodies. At sea level, the atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters mercury. So as the elevation above sea level goes up, the pressure goes down, and as the elevation below sea level goes down, the pressure goes up. So maintaining pressure that is fairly close to 760 millimeters mercury is actually required for a couple of different reasons. Number one, all of our body fluids, especially the blood, contain dissolved gases like nitrogen and oxygen. And if the pressure gets too low, these gases are going to bubble out of solution. So having actual gas bubbles in our bodily fluid is actually a very, very, very bad thing, and it is very undesirable. Most commonly, you see this in cases of what is called the bends, or more commonly called decompression sickness. You often see this in deep sea divers who descend down to a high pressure and then resurface too quickly. The change in pressure actually causes gases dissolved in the blood to bubble out of solution, and this can be a very, very, very big problem for those divers when they come back to the surface. And then number two, the mechanics of breathing in and out to pull gas into our lungs and breathing out to push gas out of the lungs, this involves changing the pressure inside of our lungs relative to what the pressure outside the lungs is. So if the atmospheric pressure gets too wonky, that might exceed the ability of our lungs and of our thoracic muscles to keep up, so we may not be able to breathe properly. You often see this with altitude sickness, people who like to climb mountains for a living. On the top of a tall mountain, the pressure is very low, and in order to pull that air into the lungs are going to have to work a lot harder, and those respiratory muscles are going to have to work a lot harder. Okay, that's going to pretty much do it for this video. Here is a list of vocabulary terms I think you ought to be familiar with after this video. And as for checking your understanding, number one, how are food molecules and oxygen related to the energy our cells produce? Number two, why is water more important than any other nutrient we get from our diets? And number three, why can we not live just anywhere on Earth? These are very general questions that you should hopefully have some insight to be able to answer after watching this video. Okay, that's going to do it. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments section, and I will see you for the next video. So long.